Last night, Israel agreed to a 10-day ceasefire in Lebanon. The announcement came from the White House. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu confirmed it. Lebanese leaders accepted it. The ceasefire began at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. 2 hours later, Israeli forces opened fire in southern Lebanon. This isn't speculation. Lebanese news agencies reported shelling and gunfire in multiple villages after the ceasefire start time. The Lebanese National News Agency documented Israeli army shooting at civilians and using drones in areas that were supposed to be quiet. The ceasefire was barely 2 hours old, and it was already being violated. Let me show you what actually happened. Yesterday afternoon, President Trump announced that Israel and Lebanon had agreed to a 10-day ceasefire. The purpose was clear: pause the fighting between Israel and Hezbollah, give diplomacy a chance, reduce civilian casualties that have been mounting in Lebanon for the past 6 weeks. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu said he agreed to the truce to advance peace efforts with Lebanon. He framed it as a step toward long-term stability. Lebanese President Joseph Aoun expressed hope that this could lead to a broader agreement. The ceasefire was scheduled to begin at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, April 16th. That's midnight in Beirut. News footage showed crowds celebrating in parts of Lebanon as the deadline approached. People displaced by weeks of Israeli airstrikes hoped they could finally return home. Families separated by the conflict began making plans to reunite. And then the ceasefire started. Within 2 hours, Lebanese authorities reported Israeli military activity in southern Lebanon, shelling in multiple villages, gunfire targeting civilians attempting to return to their homes, drone surveillance continuing over areas that were supposed to be ceasefire zones. The Lebanese National News Agency specifically reported Israeli army shelling and gunfire in parts of southern Lebanon after the designated start time. The reports weren't vague. They named locations. They described what happened. But here's where it gets worse. Israel announced it would keep troops in southern Lebanon during the ceasefire. That's not how ceasefires work. A ceasefire means you stop fighting and withdraw forces. But Netanyahu made it clear that Israeli forces would remain deployed in Lebanese territory throughout the 10-day period. Hezbollah responded immediately. The group issued a statement saying the Lebanese people have the right to resist Israeli forces on Lebanese soil. That's not a ceasefire statement. That's a warning that fighting could resume at any moment. So we have a ceasefire where one side keeps troops in the other side's territory. And within hours of it starting, there are reports of violence. This isn't the first time this has happened. In November 2024, Israel and Lebanon agreed to a ceasefire that was supposed to end months of fighting. The United Nations documented more than 10,000 violations of that agreement, most of them by Israeli forces. Israeli airstrikes continued. Ground operations continued. The ceasefire existed on paper, but the reality on the ground looked a lot like war. And now we're watching the same pattern repeat. The 10-day ceasefire announced yesterday is separate from the U.S.-Iran ceasefire that expires on April 22nd. That ceasefire, brokered by Pakistan, covers the war between the United States and Iran. It doesn't include Lebanon. Iran demanded that any deal with the U.S. must include a ceasefire in Lebanon. The U.S. and Israel both rejected that. They said Lebanon is a separate issue. Hezbollah is a separate conflict. So now we have 2 ceasefires. The U.S.-Iran ceasefire expires in 5 days. The Israel-Lebanon ceasefire is supposed to last 10 days. But if the Lebanon ceasefire is already breaking down after 2 hours, what are the chances it lasts 10 days? And here's the bigger problem. Hezbollah entered the war with Israel because of Iran. When the U.S. and Israel attacked Iran on February 28th, Hezbollah launched rockets into northern Israel in solidarity with Tehran. Israel responded with airstrikes and an invasion of southern Lebanon. More than 2,100 people have been killed in Lebanon since the fighting escalated. Over 1 million have been displaced. Israeli strikes haven't just hit Hezbollah targets. They've hit residential areas, infrastructure, civilian buildings. On the Israeli side, at least 12 soldiers and 2 civilians have been killed by Hezbollah attacks. Now there's a ceasefire. But Israeli troops remain in Lebanon. Hezbollah says resistance is justified. and reports of violence are coming in hours after the ceasefire supposedly began. Meanwhile, Trump is optimistic. Yesterday, he said he might go to Pakistan to sign a peace deal with Iran. He claimed Iran has agreed to give back nuclear material. He said a lot of agreements have been reached, but U.S. officials told reporters that no formal agreement has been made. Pakistan's army chief flew to Tehran yesterday to try to arrange a second round of talks before the April 22nd deadline. The first round of talks last weekend failed after 21 hours of negotiations. So Trump says a deal is close. Pakistan is flying emergency missions to Tehran to keep talks alive. And the U.S.-Iran ceasefire expires in 5 days with no extension agreed. At the same time, the U.S. blockade of Iranian ports continues. The Pentagon announced last night that the blockade has been fully implemented. They claim economic trade into and out of Iran by sea has been completely halted. But Iranian media reported that 4 ships transited waters near Iran on Wednesday despite the blockade. Marine traffic data confirmed the movements. Greek-operated vessels, Chinese-operated vessels, an Iranian-flagged container ship, all moving in and out of Iranian waters while the blockade is supposedly in effect. So the blockade is either working or it isn't. The ceasefire in Lebanon is either holding or it isn't. The peace talks with Iran are either progressing or they aren't. And all of this is happening while multiple deadlines are running. The U.S.-Iran ceasefire expires April 22nd. The Israel-Lebanon ceasefire is supposed to last 10 days. Pakistan is mediating between the U.S. and Iran. Israel and Lebanon are holding peace talks in Washington. But if a ceasefire can't survive 2 hours without violations, what are the chances any of these agreements hold? Here's what we know happened in those first 2 hours after the Lebanon ceasefire began. Israeli forces were already positioned throughout southern Lebanon from weeks of ground operations. The ceasefire didn't require them to withdraw. Netanyahu specifically said troops would stay. Lebanese civilians, hearing about the ceasefire, began trying to return to their homes in southern Lebanon. Many had been displaced for weeks. They thought the ceasefire meant it was safe to go back. Israeli forces, still deployed in those areas, reportedly opened fire. The Lebanese government said civilians were shot at. Drones were used. Shelling occurred. From Israel's perspective, they might argue they were responding to threats. They might say Hezbollah fighters were among the civilians. They might claim self-defense. But the ceasefire had just started. 2 hours. And already there were reports of violence that the Lebanese government says violated the agreement. Hezbollah's response was immediate. The statement about the right to resist came within hours. That's not the language of a group committed to a ceasefire. That's the language of a group preparing to fight. And if Hezbollah resumes attacks, Israel will respond, and the 10-day ceasefire becomes meaningless. This matters beyond Lebanon. The U.S.-Iran ceasefire is fragile. Iran has said repeatedly that any deal with Washington must include an end to Israeli attacks on Lebanon. The U.S. has refused to make that part of the agreement. If the Lebanon ceasefire collapses, Iran has less reason to extend the ceasefire with the U.S. And if the U.S.-Iran ceasefire expires without an extension, the war restarts. Missiles fly again. The blockade continues. Oil prices spike. Pakistan has been mediating desperately. Their army chief is in Tehran right now trying to salvage talks. But Pakistan can't force Israel to honor a ceasefire in Lebanon. And they can't force Iran to accept a deal that doesn't include Lebanon. The U.S. position is that these are separate issues. The war with Iran is one conflict. The fighting in Lebanon is another. They can be resolved separately. But Iran doesn't see it that way. Hezbollah is Iran's most powerful ally in the region. An attack on Hezbollah is an attack on Iran's interests. Israel bombing Lebanon while negotiating peace with Iran doesn't make sense to Tehran. So now we have a situation where multiple ceasefires are supposed to be in effect. Multiple peace talks are happening. Multiple deadlines are approaching. And the first test of whether any of this can work was the Lebanon ceasefire that started last night. 2 hours later, it was already breaking. The Lebanese government reported violations. Hezbollah issued warnings. Israeli troops remained in place. Civilians were caught in the middle. Trump said yesterday that he's optimistic about peace with Iran. He said agreements have been reached. He suggested he might fly to Pakistan to sign a deal. But if a 10-day ceasefire in Lebanon can't survive 2 hours, how does a long-term peace agreement with Iran survive 5 days? Or 5 weeks? Or 5 years? The pattern is clear. Agreements are announced. Ceasefires are declared. And then the fighting continues. November 2024, Israel-Lebanon ceasefire announced. 10,000 violations documented. April 8, 2026, U.S.-Iran ceasefire announced. Iran immediately starts rebuilding missile bases. April 16, 2026, Israel-Lebanon ceasefire announced. Violations reported within 2 hours. At some point, the pattern becomes the story. Not the agreements, not the optimistic statements. The pattern of agreements that don't hold. Israel agreed to a ceasefire last night. 2 hours later, Lebanese authorities were reporting shelling and gunfire. Hezbollah was warning about resistance. Civilians were being shot at trying to return home. The ceasefire exists on paper, but on the ground in southern Lebanon, it's not clear anything has actually changed. And with 5 days left until the U.S.-Iran ceasefire expires, the failure of the Lebanon ceasefire doesn't inspire confidence that peace is anywhere close. Israel agreed to stop fighting. 2 hours later, the fighting continued. That's not a ceasefire. That's a pause between escalations. And the next escalation might not wait 10 days to arrive.